Greetings, fellow students of our Wilmette Institute. This is Unit 10 on living a Baha'i life, acting according to the Baha'i writings. And we've got a really cool, hopefully brief, but really neat metaphor kind of example to use this time. And that is the tip of the iceberg. And so this is living a Baha'i life, the iceberg metaphors of science and spirit. And we'll jump right into this. What the basic idea of the iceberg is that self and ego and the way we see the world is basically the tips of the icebergs here, and that in the depths below are the true wonders of this new revelation and living the Baha'i life according to the writings of Baha'u'llah. And there are numerous metaphors of both science and spirit. The acronym ROSE is used, and we'll go through that, which is an important symbol in the Baha'i faith. And we'll begin with the idea of self and ego. And the tip of the iceberg is self and ego and the human will, our veiled human will. And we're going to get into, we've talked about reification in the past, how we represent reality. And Schopenhauer says, his opus is will and representation. That's what we're getting into. We have talked about representation with reification. Now we're speaking of will and following the laws of God and how to live a Baha'i life. And yet it goes much deeper. The tip of the iceberg is we're seeing life through 10,000 different veils. And there's a model of both science and spirit with the analogy table, which we'll look at for a second. And then also what lies beneath the surface, the will of God that's really driving everything, even though we can't always see those graces and blessings with our little teeny strip of prefrontal cortex here until we get some humility that demonstrates our helplessness to really understand. And so let's take a look at this analogy table to begin with. Here we have our surface area, our little strip of prefrontal cortex. And here's all of what's going on below that. And there are many different analogies of this in terms of what's above and what's below. In our brain, we speak in psychology of the conscious and the subconscious. There's a lot going on just in our own minds and brains that we don't know about. In the spirit, of course, we have the body. We live our bodily existence, but according to Baha'u'llah, the universe is folded within us. So our actions have ramifications eternally and infinitely, because all these veiled things below the surface, when the drop, not to mix a metaphor, but rejoins the ocean, all these things in our soul become obvious, and the body was just a brief little beginning step in our evolution. Will, what can we do here? Above, we have our human will. Can basically move a few muscles, get together and use tools and create technology, but all of our successes are really the will of God underneath. Until we see those graces and blessings, we keep making inappropriate, incorrect attributions, and that constantly gets us in trouble with the law of unintended consequences as we try to optimize our choices, and we'll look at that in a little second. The new laws of Baha'u'llah brought on how to live our lives, the standard for our choices, both the little choices and our harmonizing with the big choices, which are the will of God, where all good comes from. Baha'u'llah says all bad and mistakes and evil come from the self and the ego. All good comes from God. We want to immerse ourselves in all good and great choices. It's immersing ourselves in the will of God and the laws of God. So above this, we have discipline. We try our hardest to do our best. But there's this gigantic thing below it, which is surrender. And finally, our actions. Above the line, we have balance, which is an important concept. And below, we have harmony with the will of God. And so now, in terms of optimal choice theories, it gets us to that humility and that balance. If we just look at how do we make our choices and why are choices so filled with error all the time? It's because we're making them at this top level and not harmonizing with the will of God in all of our actions, all of our choices. So even with computational theology, the computational brilliance of what we're doing with artificial intelligence, machine learning, we have basically search trees, decision trees, and behavior trees, which have done very well in terms of making better and better choices. The problem is we don't have the attribution correct of how many of those results are God's grace and how much are human ego choices. And this is a huge, huge change in the whole idea of both reification, where Baha'u'llah has completely renovated theology and philosophy. And I'm proposing now that with attribution theory and choice theory and computational decision making, that he has also completely revolutionized attribution theory within psychology. And so if we look at our search tree, we have to know the best candidates from millions possible. Our computers can do it to an extent, but there are so many with just one decision that the idea that we will make the right choice all by ourselves becomes overwhelming if we look at it with humility and intelligence. Decision trees, we have to weight all of those candidate choices in order to rank and weight and rank them according to what is the best choice to make, the optimal choice. We keep making errors because there are so many of these outcomes, even just in the next, year of one decision, let alone centuries. So at the further our headlights have to go out, the weaker and weaker become the foundation of our choices. Well, how can we do anything good at all? You might ask. Well, the balance has got the wrong attribution, that God's grace is doing a lot of this. Much of this is God's blessings and grace going on beneath the surface. And we think our choices are so great. Here comes ego, and it's really God doing all the good. They come together here in our funnel, in our iceberg, with standards, which are the new laws of God. The choices can't see the wider picture, the wider sweep of what's going on in time and in space. And that's why we have so many unintended consequences as hard as we try. From infinitely different related choices. We're just talking about one choice here. What about adding all those other choices that blend together like the flapping wings of the butterfly in chaos theory? Yes, it's impossible to see. I mean, we make a left turn somewhere and our life completely changes. I mean, we would be in a state of continual either denial or continual fear, like the little woodland creatures looking every direction to where the eagle is coming to grab them next. If we didn't have this denial. And we don't need the denial, because once we see the will of God working within everything, we can have confidence. Finally, the behavior trees, all this false confidence due to the wrong attributions in our choices, we don't see that grace at work, and that necessitates difficult lessons in surrender until we see the real will below the false iceberg tip of the human ego and will, meaning we keep crashing and burning because we haven't yet seen that. And that gets to attribution theory, the new form of attribution theory, not just internal and external and balanced, but a complete renovation of the idea where we start attributing so much more, 99.99% to the will of God, until we surrender and see that we have God's will when we merge with God's will, and we're doing God's will through his standards and laws. And this is just a normal everyday search where we have to look at the candidates, decide how to make them, what standard are we comparing them to, and then how do we act. Unaware of that, we have to continually balance the successful outcomes when we wrongly attribute them to ego competence instead of the grace of God. So we get stuck thinking that we're doing wonderful things, which we are when we're in harmony, but a lot of this is grace and blessings of God. So in the balance, Baha'u'llah says, as we look at what do we do and what do we have to choose and what is really God, the attribution, the Bab says the most precious thing in the sight of God is balance. The most beloved thing, Baha'u'llah says, is justice, which is balance. And then Baha'u'llah says to put everything in the balance you possess, that we need insight in order to understand that. So that's kind of the human tip of the iceberg part of it. And we then move on to the rows, which are deeper and deeper stages of our actions and our will. And we will quickly go through this in terms of what are we responsible for and what's happening due to the will of God. Quickly, the R is recognition of revelation. And that's the first step of getting away from self and will. Baha'u'llah says there are two steps, or twin duties. First is recognize Baha'u'llah as the new source, attributing correctly what's going on, and attributing correctly attribution theory and its new garment how we should actually make choices and decide based on the standards set by Baha'u'llah. The first one is living a Baha'i life according to seeing the station of Baha'u'llah as the authority for today, and second, obedience to all the laws that he related. So that gets us quickly to the O, which is obedience. And we obey out of the love of the beauty of Baha'u'llah after making that primal choice, the one choice we can make, which is making his cause the love of our life, the center of our life. And that harmonizes with those unseen depths of this iceberg. And if all day long we go through life with that iceberg thought, we will have no pride at all. We'll be so thankful and grateful in a state of prayer, meditation, and ecstasy, because we'll see that all of those things are coming together. You know, all the lights are turning green, because we're no longer fighting life up at the tip of the iceberg, but seeing where all the real causality is. And that's the essence of attribution theory, is causality. Also the essence of systems thinking. The essence of the computational mindset. It's all has to do with solving problems based on not just the tiny or even team of minds, but understanding where the good and the blessed really is below the iceberg. Baha'u'llah says that the greatest minds have all solved the greatest problems, and harmonizing with that unseen will is the way that, through obedience at first, and then secondly, even deeper, through surrender, where we actually give up our will, where the Bab says the purpose of the human will is to surrender it to God's will. And if we do a lot of hard work, Baha'u'llah tells us the service of the servants belong to God, not the servants. So this is truly a new type, never seen before, of attribution theory, where Baha'u'llah says everything should be attributed to God. Well, that doesn't mean, oh boy, I have no responsibility because God does everything. We still have a responsibility within the balance, because the first responsibility is to first obey and then surrender, and then the third E step we'll get to. But the whole prayer Baha'u'llah gives us of, if it be thy will, make my movement in stillness to be wholly directed by thee, is a great example of the ultimate surrender, where we're not dealing with the tip of the iceberg and unforeseen consequences, and that we're actually harmonized completely with the will of God, following those laws and then surrendering to them. And he says, Baha'u'llah says, the source of all good is trust in God, submission unto his command, and contentment with his holy will and pleasure. So he's calling us to something fun and wonderful, contentment in his will, contentment, ecstasy, joy. And E, could E be ecstasy? Well, E is enlightenment, but it's also ecstasy. There's a lot of E's here. The deepest step we can get after surrender and obedience is giving up our very existence. It's non-existence and evanescence of self in the light of Baha'u'llah's will. And all our actions then are carried forward with a beauty and a harmony that come with harmonizing with the standards, the new standards he has set in our lives. And there are many other E's: the extinction of self, as we mentioned, evolution, our personal, spiritual, and evolution as a planet. Emptiness, the Buddha's idea of being emptied of all illusion and delusion and denial, so that we are harmonized with the will of God. We're confident. We see that there is a giant iceberg below, not something we're worried about hitting, but something we have to merge with that ocean, so that the universe within can direct our actions. Ecstasy, letting go of everything, and in turn encompassing everything, and much else. So that's the sort of ultimate step of our rose, stepping through from the self and ego to bearing in mind how many veils there are at this level. Baha'u'llah says 10,000 or 20,000 veils. We can barely see the light through this sensory mind of our body. But when we look back into those combinations of body and soul and balance out, our actions become very, very integrated with everything that lies, the rose that lies beneath the surface of all of our thoughts, words, and actions. And we become grateful, a spirit of continual gratitude, because once we realize our helplessness, Baha'u'llah says if you look into the slightest little thing, you'll see helplessness because we can't understand even an atom completely. And if we get into the field of choice and living our lives and how do we choose what to do and how to act and live a Baha'i life, we find that it's clearly without this God's grace continually around us, we would never succeed in everything and anything. And so it's sad that we don't give God credit where credit is due for everything that is working, this wonderful blessing of Baha'u'llah revolutionizing science, and we continually to incorrectly attribute it. And in the field of machine learning and my area of artificial intelligence and machine learning, one of the most difficult things to get our arms around is phenomenology or qualia. And that's got to do with the combination of attribution and reification. This has never been really looked at before until Baha'u'llah has come. Reification in terms of how do we represent reality in our minds and with our computers, our silicon children. Also, then, how do we get that humans can do this amazing thing of qualia? It comes down to attribution, because we look at a rose and we smell it and we attribute that externally, like, oh, this object is really the source of this beauty and all this wonderful scent in this rose, but it's all happening inside reification, civilization inside of our mind. So it's an internal thing that's going on. And that attribution is fun and funny because we do it all day long to warp reality to our desires instead of surrendering to the desire of God and seeing reality directly. Like you're driving down the road and you get a flat tire and you're swearing and cursing because you went into a pothole, and you're saying, this government, they don't ever fix the roads. The roads just finished some rain in winter and it's filled with potholes. It's ruining our tires, you know, and nobody thinks, gee, I drove into a pothole. I had something to do with that. I didn't avoid it. You know, I mean, nothing is simple, no causality. In fact, it's infinite in either direction, the past and the future. We really can't get it with this part of our brain. So if we continually attribute things with self and ego, we're going to be in the continual mess of making decisions and living a life that is ego-centered and that is continually unsuccessful. If someone really does great in life and they say, look, there's an example, somebody actually did everything out of self and ego, they're an atheist and they still did well, guess what? God helps atheists too. Everybody, His grace comes to everyone. It's still incorrectly attributed, all the success. It comes from God. It comes from Baha'u'llah. So if all day long we can remember this, all the lights are going to turn green. As soon as we find out this is all below the will of God, and then we submit to it, make every decision based on the motive of love for that grace, then this will shrink and shrink and shrink and shrink, and before you know it, we'll be living with recognition of the manifestation, obedience to His laws, surrender of every moment to the depth, and finally the deepest depth, merging in non-existence with the ocean itself. Friends, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to check this out and make comments below. We'll have links, and we're putting this on our new Baha'i channel, the new Baha'i TV channel we've got going, soon to be on Roku. So hopefully some of this content in our chat will continue to inspire other steps, both in how Baha'u'llah has revolutionized not only philosophy and psychology, but all of our lives, so that we can go through them with a feeling of bliss and gratitude, and that will also transform the planet and get us out of this self and ego mode that is rapidly destroying our wonderful blue marble, our Mother Earth. Thank you again.